Welcome back to the Deep Dive. So glad you're joining us today.
Great to be here.
We are plunging headfirst into a topic that feels incredibly relevant right now. Navigating the complex, sometimes chaotic world of cybersecurity incidents and vulnerabilities.
Yeah, it's definitely front of mind for a lot of people.
And it's not just about, the attackers out there, the bad guys. It's fundamentally about having a clear practice plan for when, not if, things go wrong in your digital world.
Exactly. Think of it less as just building a fortress, high walls and all that. It's more like having a detailed emergency plan, evacuation routes worked out, fire suppression systems ready inside the fortress.
Right. Stuff you hope you never actually need.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But when that alarm inevitably sounds, knowing exactly what to do, who's responsible for what, and who you need to call, well, that's absolutely non-negotiable.
So our mission for this deep dive is to extract the absolutely essential insights from some, incredibly comprehensive guidelines. These were developed to help organizations get ready for, detect, respond to, and ultimately recover from cyber attacks.
And also how they tackle those critical weaknesses, the vulnerabilities, before they get exploited, or sometimes right as they're being exploited. It's two sides of the same coin, really.
Okay, so we'll explore the standard phases, the crucial coordination that's needed, and then we're going to anchor all of this with a recent, really fascinating real-world example. It shows just how technical vulnerabilities can be, weaponized.
And having robust defenses is vital, of course, firewalls, antivirus, patching routines, all the good stuff. But just as important is having that clear, well-practiced response plan.
Because security isn't just about preventing breaches anymore.
Not entirely, no. It's just as much about minimizing the damage and ensuring business continuity when a breach inevitably happens or a critical vulnerability surfaces.
And this deep dive is brought to you by Stonefly, a leader in enterprise storage, backup and disaster recovery, AI storage, and cloud solutions.
They really cover the spectrum there.
They do. And if you're looking for secure, ransomware-proof storage, then Stonefly sells air-gapped and immutable storage. You can contact sales@stonefly.com to schedule a demo.
Good option to have in your back pocket, especially considering today's topic.
Definitely. Okay, so let's unpack this. We're looking at guidelines that essentially lay out two related but distinct sets of actions organizations need to be prepared for.
Right. Two main scenarios, each with its own playbook, you could say. One playbook is focused on responding to active incidents.
Okay, incidents
Meaning you have confirmed malicious cyber activity occurring right now within your systems. Someone is actively doing something they shouldn't be. The house is on fire, so to speak.
Got it. And the other?
The other set of procedures is for responding to vulnerabilities, specifically critical weaknesses that have been identified, particularly those that are known to be actively exploited by attackers out in the wild.
Okay, so incident response is for when the fire is definitely raging, and vulnerability response is more like finding out there's a critical structural flaw in your building, one that arsonists are known to target, and you need to fix it fast.
That's a really good analogy, actually.
Yeah.
The overarching goal for both playbooks is to provide a standard, reliable process.
Standardization. Why is that so key here?
Well, it helps organizations quickly identify the problem, coordinate their response effectively, both internally and with external partners, like CISA, remediate the issue, whether that's kicking out an attacker or applying a patch, recover operations smoothly, and importantly, accurately track how they address the situation and what mitigations they put in place.
Now, these specific guidelines were developed mainly for the federal civilian executive branch, the FCEB agencies, right?
That's correct. They were developed with FCEB agencies primarily in mind, driven partly by things like Executive Order 14028.
But the principles sound like they'd apply pretty much anywhere.
Oh, absolutely. While the specific reporting mandates and some coordination mechanisms might be tailored for federal agencies, the core concepts, the phases, the activities they're based on widely recognized cybersecurity frameworks and best practices. Think NIST SP 861, the standard for incident handling.
So good practice is good practice regardless of sector.
Exactly. And these guidelines cover response actions, whether the incident is detected internally by the agency's own SOC, or if they get a call from a third party like CISA or law enforcement, or even a contractor finding something.
What don't they cover, just for clarity?
Right, important distinction. These particular playbooks specifically carve out classified information systems and national security systems, or NSS. Those have their own separate, often more stringent response protocols.
Got it. So standardizing the process for the vast majority of federal systems, you mentioned standardization helps, but why is it so crucial, especially when things are hitting the fan during an incident?
It's absolutely foundational for an effective response, particularly when you're dealing with complex environments or, widespread events that might hit multiple parts of an organization or even multiple organizations at once.
Like a supply chain attack or a major vulnerability affecting lots of places?
Exactly. Standardization means everyone involved, internal IT, security teams, leadership, external responders like CISA, is basically speaking the same language and following a predictable process.
Okay, that reduces confusion.
Massively.
Yeah.
It facilitates much smoother, quicker coordination, especially during a crisis. It allows for consistent tracking. What actions were taken?
Yeah.
Were they successful? That's vital for accountability and for learning later on.
Right, you need to know what worked and what didn't.
For sure. It helps in cataloging incidents over time to spot trends. It guides the analysis so everyone is asking the right questions about scope and impact. Ultimately, it ensures the response is consistent, effective, and repeatable, even when your staff are under immense stress.
You don't want people making up procedures on the fly during an attack.
Absolutely not. Having these steps documented and practiced beforehand is about building essential muscle memory for the team. It frees them up to think critically about the specifics of the incident, rather than wrestling with basic process.
Okay, let's dive into the incident response playbook first then. This is the one for confirmed malicious cyber activity, where there's potential for a major incident. What's the typical life cycle look like here?
It follows pretty well-established phases, drawing heavily, as I mentioned, from frameworks like NIST, SP 861, Revision 2. The life cycle actually begins long before an incident even happens, with preparation.
Okay, makes sense. Get ready first.
Then, if an incident occurs, you move into detection and analysis that's figuring out what's actually happening. After that comes containment, which is all about stopping the bleeding.
Containing the damage.
Right. Then you have eradication and recovery, cleaning up the mess and ensuring normal operations securely. And finally, post-incident activities, which is crucial for learning and improving your defenses.
And it's not always perfectly linear step by step.
No, definitely not. It's crucial to understand that many activities are iterative. You might be knee-deep in containment, find some new evidence of compromise, and suddenly you have to loop back to the analysis phase to understand this new information. You keep cycling through the relevant phases until the incident is fully resolved and closed out.
Okay, let's start at the beginning then. Phase 1, preparation. This is all about building that foundation before disaster strikes. What are the absolute must-haves to be truly ready?
Preparation is, well, you could argue it's the single most critical phase, because what you do here determines your capability to respond effectively when the time comes. The whole goal is to mitigate the potential impact before the incident even starts. It's about ensuring you have the right plans, the right tools, the right people, and the right knowledge already in place.
Like having your fire extinguishers inspected regularly, escape routes clearly marked, and running fire drills so people know what to do without thinking?
Precisely that analogy. It really starts with having clear policies and procedures. This isn't just one generic plan. It means documented incident response plans, possibly tailored to different types of incidents. Ransomware is different from data theft, which is different from denial of service, right?
Sure, requires different action.
Exactly. You need clearly defined roles and responsibilities. Who does what during an incident? Who's in charge? You absolutely need to designate a coordination lead or an incident manager who takes charge when something happens.
Someone calls the shots.
Yes. And you need established procedures for escalating the incident based on severity. And for reporting it, who needs to know when and how, both internally and externally.
Like reporting to CISA within that hour for federal agencies.
That's a key reporting procedure, yes. Contingency plans are also vital. What happens if your internal team is overwhelmed? How do you get additional resources or specialized expertise? Do you have agreements in place with third-party IR firms?
And engaging law enforcement.
Yes. Documented procedures for when and how to engage with law enforcement are crucial too. Now, why is having all this documentation so critical? Because in the heat of the moment, the confusion and high-stress environment of a real incident,
People panic, forget things.
they can or they hesitate. Clear, accessible documentation prevents that hesitation, ensures critical steps aren't missed, and allows people to focus on doing what needs to be done rather than trying to figure out what they should be doing.
Makes sense. What's next after policies?
Next up is instrumentation. This is all about having comprehensive visibility into your environment. It's simple. You cannot detect or investigate what you cannot see.
Okay, so monitoring tools.
Lots of them, deployed widely. Implementing telemetry sources across your network and endpoints is key. We're talking deploying antivirus, AV, certainly, but more advanced things like endpoint detection and response, EDR, data loss prevention, DLP systems, intrusion detection, and prevention systems, IDPS.
Eyes on the network, eyes on the machines.
Exactly. And crucially, it means having robust log collection and analysis capabilities. You need to be collecting logs from practically everything.
Like what specifically?
Host operating systems, critical applications running on those hosts, cloud platforms, IaaS, PaaS, SaaS, network devices giving you flow data like NetFlow or SFlow, maybe even capturing full network packets, PCAP, in critical segments for deep dive analysis if needed.
That's a lot of data.
It is. And all this diverse log data needs to be centralized. You can't have analysts logging into hundreds of individual machines. It needs to be fed into a security information and event management system, a SIEM.
So you can correlate events across different systems.
Precisely. That's where you spot the patterns that indicate an attack chain. For federal agencies, this also includes integrating alerts from shared government systems like Einstein and the Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigations CDM program.
And there's a big push for more logging recently.
Yes, a major emphasis, particularly driven by recent directives following major incidents, is implementing enhanced logging, basically turning on more detailed logging options that might be off by default and ensuring those logs are retained for sufficient periods, often 12 months or more, to support thorough investigation long after an event.
It makes perfect sense. You can't find what you can't see, and you definitely can't investigate 6 months later if the logs from the time of the breach are already gone.
Exactly. If the logs aren't collected centrally where analysts can access and correlate them across potentially many compromised systems, you're essentially trying to solve a complex mystery with half the clues missing, maybe more.
And all that technology, all those logs,
Yeah.
they need trained people to actually use them effectively.
Absolutely. That brings us to trained response personnel. Your team needs to be not just technically skilled in using the tools, but also specifically trained in your incident response procedures. And critically, they need to be regularly exercised.
Drills. Like fire drills, but for cyber.
Exactly. Tabletop exercises, where you talk through a scenario, simulated attacks, maybe using breach and attack simulation tools, wargaming against a red team. These build the necessary muscle memory and highlight gaps in your plans or skills before a real incident.
Who needs this training? Just the core security team?
The core team, yes, but also understanding how you'd leverage resources from a parent agency, if you're part of a larger organization, or how you'd bring in and manage those third-party incident response firms if you need them.
And testing recovery, too.
Oh, absolutely critical. A really important, often overlooked element of preparation is conducting regular recovery exercises. Test your continuity of operations, see to it plans. Test your failover systems. Test your backups, can you actually restore from them? Test your ability to completely recover compromised systems from known good, clean states. You need high confidence that you can get back to normal operations securely after a major event.
Because just stopping the attacker isn't enough if you can't recover the business.
Exactly. People are arguably the most critical component of your defense, and they need to be ready and practiced for the entire life cycle, including recovery.
Okay, policies, tools, people. What else for preparation?
Then there's cyber threat intelligence, or CTI. This isn't just passively reading security news headlines, though that's part of awareness.
It's more active.
Much more active. It means actively monitoring threat feeds from multiple sources. Government sources like CISA alerts, trusted partners in your industry or information sharing groups, ISAC CISOs, open source intelligence communities, and commercial threat intelligence providers. And critically, you need processes to quickly ingest relevant indicators from these feeds into your defensive tools.
Feeding indicators into the SIEM or firewall block lists, that sort of thing.
Yes, exactly. Ingesting indicators into your SIEM for detection correlation, into your EDR for endpoint hunting, maybe into firewall or proxy block lists.
You mentioned indicators, things like known malicious IP addresses or the hash of a piece of malware.
Yes, those are what we often call atomic indicators. They're useful for detecting specific, known bad things, especially related to a particular campaign that's active right now.
But attackers change those things quickly, right?
They do. Adversaries frequently change their IP addresses, domains, malware hashes. So atomic indicators can go stale quite quickly, sometimes in days or even hours. What's often more valuable and provides more sustainable detection over time are patterns of behavior, or TTP's tactics, techniques, and procedures.
Tactics, techniques, procedures. Can you break that down a bit more?
Sure. Think of it like this. A tactic is the adversary's high-level goal or objective at a certain stage, like gaining initial access to your network, or achieving persistence on a compromised system, or exfiltrating sensitive data.
Okay, the why.
Right. A technique is a specific method they use to achieve that tactic. For example, phishing is a common technique for initial access. Using Windows scheduled tasks is a common technique for achieving persistence.
The what or how.
Exactly. And the procedure is a specific implementation of that technique by a particular adversary or group, like using a specific type of phishing email lure or creating a scheduled task with a particular name pattern in command line. Frameworks like ARE, ATT, and CK provide a fantastic, standardized way to categorize and understand these TTPs across the entire attack lifecycle.
So detecting TTPs is harder but better in the long run.
Generally, yes. Detecting TTPs like spotting the abuse of legitimate tools like PowerShell for lateral movement, or recognizing a specific sequence of actions indicative of credential dumping is often more complex than just matching a known bad IP address.
But it provides much more sustainable context about the adversary's overall strategy and methods.
Because an attacker might swap out the specific malware they use the atomic indicator, but they might still rely on the same technique, like hijacking a legitimate remote service to move around the network. It's exactly right. Detecting TTPs allows you to potentially anticipate their likely next steps and build defenses that are more resilient to simple changes in attacker tooling. It shifts focus from what they use to how they operate.
And sharing this CTI.
Oh, absolutely crucial. Particularly within the broader defense community, government, critical infrastructure, industry partners, organizations are strongly encouraged, sometimes mandated, to continuously share indicators, observe TTPs, and successful countermeasures with partners like CISA. There are programs like the Automated Indicator Sharing, AIS, platform designed for this.
Because sharing makes everyone stronger.
It really does. Knowing your enemy, knowing how they operate, and sharing that knowledge quickly and widely makes the entire defense ecosystem more resilient. It helps everyone prioritize patches, tune detections, and hunt for simile activity.
What about more advanced preparation steps?
For organizations with more mature security operations, active defense can be part of preparation. This isn't about hacking back, but about proactively interacting with adversaries in a controlled way to gather intelligence.
How does that work?
It could mean setting up instrumented sandboxes or honeypot systems designed to look attractive to attackers, to redirect them and study their methods firsthand without risk to your production environment. Or deploying honey tokens, fake data files, fake credentials, fake database entries designed to act as tripwires. The moment an attacker accesses or uses a honey token, it triggers a high-fidelity alert.
Like putting fake jewels in the display case?
Kinda, yeah. Or fake accounts in your Active Directory. It helps you learn their tradecraft in real time, see exactly what tools and techniques they're using against you.
Turning the tables a bit. What about just the basic communication and logistics needed during a crisis? Seems simple, but maybe isn't.
It's fundamental, but definitely not simple to get right under pressure. Communications and logistics are absolutely foundational. You need clear, predefined procedures for communicating internally within the response team, across your agency or organization leadership, and critically, out of band with essential external partners like CISA or law enforcement.
Out of band meaning not using your main network.
Exactly. Your primary corporate email or chat system might be compromised or unavailable during an incident. So you need alternative secure channels, maybe dedicated secure chat platforms, satellite phones for key personnel, pre-established conference bridges that don't rely on your internal VoIP and IP system. You also need protocols for handling classified information if it becomes involved, and established information sharing agreements already in place with necessary parties.
Coordination relies on communication.
Completely. Everyone needs to know who is communicating what, to whom, and through which channels to avoid confusion, conflicting messages, or delays during a critical time.
Okay, one more thing under preparation.
Yes, a really important one. Operational security, OPSC, specifically for your incident response systems and team. Sophisticated attackers, especially nation-state level actors, will absolutely try to target the defender's tools and communications to blind them, disrupt the response, or see what the defenders know.
Attack the firefighters while they're fighting the fire?
That's the idea. So preparation includes things like segmenting your Security Operations Center, SOC systems and networks, away from the main corporate network, managing security devices and collecting logs via out-of-band management networks if possible, using hardened workstations specifically configured and locked down for incident response activities.
And protecting the data itself.
Yes, having robust backup and recovery capabilities specifically for your defensive systems and critical logs. Simple things matter too, like notifying users whose systems are compromised by phone or secure messaging, not via their potentially compromised corporate email account. You want to avoid inadvertently tipping off the attacker that you've detected them and are starting to respond before you're ready.
Don't let the attacker see you setting the trap or cleaning up the mess too early.
Exactly. And finally, within preparation, you need the right technical infrastructure, the actual tools needed to execute the response plan effectively, capabilities to rapidly isolate compromised systems from the network, to replicate the disk state of compromised machines for forensic analysis without altering the original, to analyze malicious code or artifacts safely in a sandbox, and importantly, to rapidly reconstitute systems from clean, trusted gold images or backups.
The practical tools of the trade.
Right. You need secure storage for instant data and forensic evidence, ensuring its integrity is maintained meticulously for potential legal use, chain of custody. You need tools for collecting forensic evidence like disk images and memory captures. You need those malware analysis sandboxes or isolated lab environments. And you absolutely need a robust case management or ticketing system to track every single step, every finding, every action taken throughout the incident response lifecycle. It provides the audit trail and coordination hub.
Okay. Preparation sounds like a huge ongoing investment, but clearly essential groundwork. Now, let's say despite all that preparation, an incident is detected. That takes us to phase 2. Detection and analysis. This sounds like where the real detective work kicks in.
It really is. This phase is often the most complex and challenging part of incident response. It's where you try to determine definitively if a malicious incident has actually occurred, figure out its type, ransomware.databreach.espionage, understand the full extent of the compromise across your entire environment, and assess its magnitude and potential impact.
And your environment could be sprawling on-prem, cloud, OT.
Exactly. It might span traditional data centers, multiple cloud providers, operational technology networks and critical infrastructure, even mobile devices or IoT. Understanding the scope across all those potential areas is tough.
And time is critical here, right? You can't spend weeks analyzing while the attacker runs rampant.
Absolutely. Time is definitely the essence. A critical early step, particularly for federal agencies under current directives, is to formally declare the incident.
Meaning you officially say, we have a problem.
Pretty much, yes. It means formally reporting it to the relevant authorities based on predefined severity criteria. For FCED agencies, this requires reporting confirmed incidents to CISA within just 1 hour of making that determination.
1 hour? That's fast.
It is fast. And for incidents deemed potentially major, concurrent reporting to the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, is also necessary. This formal declaration is important because it kicks off the formal response process, gets it on CISA's radar officially, and allows you to formally request and receive external support if needed.
What happens after you report it?
You'll typically receive a tracking number from CISA, and they'll assign a risk rating based on the National Cyber Incident Scoring System, or NCISS.
NCISS, what's that?
Think of NCISS as a standardized way used across the federal government to quickly rate the potential impact and severity of a cyber incident based on observable factors. It helps ensure everyone understands the urgency and potential consequences using a common scale.
Okay, incident declared, ticket opened. What's next?
Once declared, the immediate focus is to determine the investigation scope. Using all that telemetry and data you hopefully prepared for analyzing network traffic, digging through logs from various systems, looking at host artifacts found on endpoints, you start trying to map out the boundaries of the compromise.
Trying to figure out how far the fire has spread.
Good analogy again, yes. You try to identify the initial access vector the adversary used, how did they get in, which assets are affected, servers, workstations, specific cloud instances, critical data stores. What's the adversary's privilege level within the environment? Are they just a standard user, or did they get admin rights? And what's the observed or potential operational or informational impact? Are systems down? Is data being stolen? You have to follow the trail the attacker left behind.
Where does this initial information usually come from?
Initial scoping information might come from various places. Automated alerts from your CM or EDR systems are common triggers. User reports of suspicious activity, my computer is acting weird, can sometimes be the first sign. Notifications from third parties like CISA or a threat intel provider saying they see malicious traffic from your network. Findings from your own proactive threat hunting teams who are looking for anomalies. It's about gathering those first clues to get your initial bearings on the battlefield.
And as you're digging into this, you have to be careful about preserving the evidence, right? For later analysis or even legal reasons.
Crucially important. You need to actively collect and preserve data throughout the investigation. This involves gathering all relevant data from perimeter devices, firewalls, proxies, internal network infrastructure, switches, routers, DNS servers, and especially from affected endpoints, servers, workstations. Logs are absolutely vital, but you might also need to collect transaction data from applications, system configuration files, memory dumps from running processes, and full forensic disk images of compromised or potentially compromised systems.
And handle it carefully.
Meticulously. This data must be preserved carefully, following established digital forensic best practices to maintain its integrity. It needs to be treated as best evidence, particularly if law enforcement involvement is likely down the road. This means maintaining a detailed, time-stamped log of all evidence, handling who collected what, when they collected it, where it came from, where it's stored, and how it was handled, for example, hashing the files. This is essential for maintaining the chain of custody.
Because the evidence tells the story.
It does. It's the detailed story of the attack, and it's necessary for thorough technical analysis for understanding the root cause and potentially for legal action or attribution efforts later.
Okay, evidence collected. Then comes the deep analysis.
Right. Next is perform technical analysis. This is where your skilled analysts really dig into the collected data to develop a deep technical and contextual understanding of exactly what happened. You correlate information from different sources, maybe matching a suspicious network connection log to a specific process execution log on a host at the same time.
Connecting the dots.
Exactly. You assess potentially anomalous activity by comparing it against your established baseline of what normal looks like for those systems and users. The primary goals here are to determine the root cause of the incident. How did they actually get in and succeed? Document the adversary's TTPs. What specific tools and methods did they use once inside? And ultimately, uncover the full attack chain, from that initial compromise all the way through to them achieving their objectives, like stealing data or deploying ransomware.
And this picture evolves.
Continuously. As you find new evidence or understand more about their methods, you constantly update and refine your understanding of the incident's scope. Maybe you find they compromised more accounts than you initially thought, or moved to systems you previously considered clean.
You're basically building that narrative of the attack step by painful step.
Exactly. And a key tool for building that narrative effectively is to correlate events and document a timeline. Analyzing all those logs and other data points to create a detailed, chronological timeline of the adversary's activities is absolutely essential.
What goes in the timeline?
It should include precise timestamps for each event, clear descriptions of what happened, e.g. user account X logged in from unexpected foreign IP address, malicious file z.ex was created in directory Y, network connection established to known C2 domain example.com, the observed impacts of each action, and importantly, the data sources that provided the evidence for each timeline entry. A clear, accurate timeline is fundamental for understanding the attack's progression, identifying key moments or decision points, and communicating effectively about the incident with leadership, partners, and other responders.
A major challenge here must be finding the subtle stuff, right? Attackers trying to hide.
Oh, definitely. A significant challenge is to identify anomalous activity that might not look overtly malicious at first glance. Sophisticated adversaries, particularly those aiming for long-term persistence or espionage, often try very hard to blend in. They use techniques called living off the land.
Living off the land.
It means they use legitimate system administration tools and processes that are already present on the target network for malicious purposes. Instead of dropping custom malware, which traditional antivirus might catch more easily, they might use built-in tools like PowerShell, Windows Management Instrumentation, WMI, PSAexec, or scheduled tasks to execute commands, move laterally, or maintain persistence.
So they're using your own tools against you, like a burglar using the homeowner's own crowbar.
Precisely. It makes detection much harder because you're looking for legitimate tools being used in slightly illegitimate or unexpected ways. You need to have a really deep understanding of what normal activity looks like in your specific environment. Normal processes, normal network traffic patterns, normal user behavior, and train your analysts to spot those subtle deviations, unusual sequences of events, or activity by legitimate tools happening at odd times from odd places or targeting unusual systems.
Hiding in plain sight. Tough job.
Very tough. And while you're looking for what they did, you absolutely must figure out how they got in the first place and what underlying conditions allowed it. That's identify root cause and enabling conditions.
The why it worked.
Exactly. Was it because they exploited a specific unpatched vulnerability in some public-facing software? Was it a misconfigured firewall rule that left a port open? Did they use weak or stolen credentials obtained from a previous breach or phishing attack? Was it a successful social engineering attack that tricked a user? Understanding that original entry point and the specific conditions, the vulnerability, the misconfiguration, the weak password policy that allowed the attack to succeed is paramount for preventing the exact same thing from happening again tomorrow. You also look for any changes the attacker might have made to system configurations or security settings after getting in, maybe to disable defenses or make their access easier.
And as you find these technical details about how they're operating,
You actively gather incident indicators. These are the specific forensic artifacts or observable behaviors you identify that are associated with the adversary's activity. This includes the indicators of compromise, IOCs, things like specific IP addresses or domains they're communicating with, unique file hashes of their malware or tools, specific registry keys they create for persistence. And it also includes the TTPs. You observe them using the techniques like spear phishing, exploiting a certain vulnerability, using PowerShell for lateral movement, dumping credentials using mimikatz, exfiltrating data over DNS tunneling.
why gather these so meticulously?
These indicators are invaluable for several reasons. First, for understanding the current incident more deeply. Second, for correlative analysis, you take these indicators and proactively search other systems, logs, and network traffic across your entire environment to see if the same activity is happening elsewhere, potentially uncovering a much wider compromise than you initially realized. And third, critically, for sharing with partners like CISA and others in the community so they can search through their networks and defend themselves proactively.
And you mentioned comparing these observed methods to known attacker playbooks, like OnMite or EU, ATT, and CK.
Yes, that's a key part of the analysis. You analyze for common adversary TTPs, comparing what you're seeing in your environment to the known techniques cataloged in established frameworks like MIT, ATT, and CK. This helps you understand the context of the attack. Is this typical behavior for ransomware gangs? Or does it look more like espionage activity? It can potentially help you predict the adversary's likely next moves based on common attack life cycles.
Can you give examples of TTPs from ATT and CK that are commonly looked for?
Sure. The guidelines mention a table with examples. For initial access, you'd look for signs of phishing attempts in email logs or exploits against public-facing applications in web server logs. For execution, you'd scrutinize command line logs, PowerShell logs, script execution events. For persistence, you'd look for new scheduled tasks, suspicious services being installed, modifications to startup folders or registry run keys, or creation of new accounts. For lateral movement, you'd analyze logs for use of remote services like RDP or SMB, or tools like PSOXAC connecting between machines. For credential access, you'd look for processes accessing sensitive files like the SAM database, or signs of tools like mimikatz running in memory, or evidence of brute force login attempts or man-in-the-middle attacks. For command and control C2, you'd analyze network traffic for connections to known bad domains OIPs, or unusual protocols being used, like DNS tunneling, or application layer protocols like HTTPS being used for C2 traffic. And for exfiltration, you'd look for large outbound data transfers, especially over unusual protocols or to suspicious destinations, maybe data being staged in archive files before sending. Understanding these TTPs helps you know what specific malicious behaviors to hunt for in your vast sea of log data and system activity.
Wow, that's a lot to look for.
It is. And throughout this entire detection and analysis phase, which can take hours, days, or even weeks for complex incidents, you must continuously validate and refine investigation scope. As you find new IOCs or observe new TTPs being used, you inevitably identify additional potentially impacted systems, user accounts, or data repositories. The initial estimate of compromise might be just one server, but the full picture can expand significantly as the investigation unfolds. Keeping your understanding of the scope, your common operating picture updated and shared with everyone involved, your team, leadership, CISA, is vital for making informed decisions about the next steps, like containment and recovery.
This phase sounds incredibly intense, a real race against time, trying to solve a complex puzzle while the attacker might still be active. What are some of the absolute core questions that your analysis must answer before you can confidently move on?
Yes, it's definitely high pressure. The critical questions you absolutely need solid answers to, or at least the best possible answers based on available evidence, include things like, what was the initial attack vector? How did they first get in? How is the adversary currently accessing the environment? Is it via the initial vector, or did they establish other backdoors? Did they exploit a vulnerability or use stolen credentials, or was it malware from phishing? How are they maintaining command and control? C2, how are they talking back to their infrastructure? Do they have any form of persistence set up on compromised systems? And if so, exactly how and where? What files, registry keys, scheduled tasks, which user accounts or service accounts are compromised, and critically, what level of privilege do those accounts have? Standard user, local admin, domain admin. How are they conducting internal reconnaissance to map the network and find high-value targets? Are they moving laterally to other systems? And if so, precisely how? What protocols, tools, accounts? And crucially, has any data been exfiltrated? If so, what type of data was accessed or potentially stolen, how much, and how did they get it out?
Answering those gives you the blueprint for the cleanup, basically.
Exactly. Answering these provides the essential factual foundation for planning effective containment and eradication strategies. You can't effectively kick someone out if you don't know all the doors they're using.
And sometimes you might need help answering those questions, right? If the incident is really bad.
Absolutely. Organizations need to be ready and willing to engage third-party analysis support if the incident exceeds their internal capacity or technical expertise. For federal agencies, CISA is typically the first call for help. Agencies usually have standing agreements, like Federal Adult Work Authorizations, FNAs, that allow them to quickly request CISA assistance, which can include deploying CISA's own hunt teams onto the agency's network to help find the adversary and understand the scope.
CISA brings in the cavalry?
They can, yes. CISA can also facilitate bringing in support from other highly specialized partners within the government, like the NSA or U.S. Cyber Command, for certain types of deep technical analysis if needed. Commercial incident response, IR firms, are also a common option, especially in the private sector. But even for federal incidents, they can play a role. However, it's important that any commercial IR support supplements, not replaces, the government's role, like CISA's coordination, for federal incidents, and their activities must be carefully coordinated with CISA and the agency's own efforts to avoid conflict or duplication.
So the message is, don't be afraid to ask for help if you're facing a major incident.
Absolutely not. Recognizing when you're overwhelmed and bringing in reinforcements quickly is often critical to limiting the damage. Finally, towards the end of the analysis phase, armed with the much better understanding you've gained about the adversary's specific methods, you adjust tools.
Meaning you tweak your defenses based on what you just learned.
Exactly. You use the specific TTPs and IOCs you found to improve your detection and prevention capabilities right now during the ongoing incident. This means tuning your SIME correlation rules to better detect the observed behaviors, adding new signatures or behavioral rules to your IDPS or EDR systems, maybe blocking newly identified malicious IP addresses or domains at your firewall or web proxy. You focus your monitoring efforts more sharply on the specific techniques the adversary is actively using, particularly those key tactics like execution, persistence, lateral movement, credential access, and C2.
So you're actively fighting back by making it harder for them to operate.
Yes. The goal is to make it harder, noisier, and riskier for the adversary to continue operating undetected within your environment and to increase the likelihood of catching them quickly if they try to move to other systems or use those same techniques again. It's an adaptive defense approach within the response itself.
Okay, so you've detected the intrusion, you've analyzed it as best you can, you know roughly what you're dealing with. The next urgent step seems to be stopping the damage from spreading further. Phase 3, containment, stopping the bleeding.
This is indeed a very high priority phase, especially during a major incident where damage might be escalating rapidly, like with ransomware encrypting files across the network. The primary objective here is straightforward: prevent the incident from causing further damage, and remove the adversary's current access to your environment.
Does the containment strategy look the same for every incident?
No, definitely not. The specific strategy and the particular actions you take will depend heavily on the type of incident you're facing. Containing a fast-spreading ransomware outbreak might require rapidly isolating large network segments or shutting down critical services immediately. Containing an attacker who is slowly and quietly exfiltrating sensitive data might involve more surgical containment actions aimed at blocking their C2 channels or isolating specific compromised accounts without tipping them off too soon. Containing an adversary who seems focused only on maintaining persistent access for future use might involve yet another set of tailored actions.
So you have to tailor the medicine to the disease. What are the key things you have to consider when you're deciding how to contain?
You have to carefully weigh several critical factors, often in real time. First, the potential impact on mission operations. Can you actually afford to isolate the affected systems or network segments right now without taking down absolutely critical business functions? Sometimes the cure can seem worse than the disease, at least initially.
A tough balancing act.
It is. Second, the estimated duration of the containment actions. How long will systems be offline or isolated? Third, what resources will you need? How much staff time? What tools, potentially bringing systems offline, might require physical access? Fourth, what level of effectiveness do you realistically expect from the planned actions? Are you aiming for full containment of the adversary across your entire network right away? Or is it more realistic to achieve only partial containment on specific segments initially, buying time for further analysis? And fifth, importantly, what is the potential impact on evidence collection? Some aggressive containment actions, like powering off systems abruptly, can destroy valuable, volatile evidence, like data and RAM, if not handled carefully with forensic procedures in mind.
And there's a risk the attacker might notice you trying to contain them.
Yes, that's a significant challenge, especially with sophisticated adversaries. They might be actively monitoring network activity, including your security tools and administrative actions. If they detect your containment efforts, starting like seeing firewall rules change or accounts being disabled, they might try to adapt quickly, maybe accelerate their data theft, destroy logs, deploy ransomware immediately, or try to burrow deeper using persistence mechanisms you haven't found yet.
So you might need to act decisively but carefully.
Exactly. Ideally, you want to have as complete a picture of the adversary's presence and methods as possible before you initiate major containment actions, to minimize the chance of tipping them off prematurely and triggering a destructive response. The very delicate balance between spending more time in analysis to get that full picture versus acting quickly in containment to limit ongoing damage. For major incidents, close coordination with CISA on your proposed containment strategy is absolutely essential to leverage their experience and ensure your actions align with broader response efforts.
Okay, so what are the actual tangible steps typically involved in containing an incident? What do you do?
Containment activities are essentially short-term mitigation actions designed to sever the attacker's active connection and prevent them from causing further harm or spreading further. Key actions often include isolating impacted systems and network segments. This might mean using network access controls, NAC, VLAN changes, or firewall rules to disconnect specific compromised servers or entire network subnets from the rest of the network or the internet. Again, you have to carefully consider mission needs and try to isolate in a way that minimizes disruption to critical services as possible.
Pulling the plug, metaphorically.
Metaphorically, yes. Critically, before you isolate or significantly alter potentially compromised systems, you should capture forensic images, both disk and memory if possible, to preserve the volatile and non-volatile evidence for later analysis. Other common steps include updating firewalls and intrusion prevention systems, IPS, to actively block known malicious IP addresses, domains, or specific malicious traffic patterns the attacker is using based on your analysis findings. You actively block unauthorized access attempts and connections used by malware or the attacker for C2. You might close specific network ports or disable services that the attacker exploited to get in or is currently using for C2 or lateral movement.
What about compromised accounts?
Absolutely vital. You must change compromised passwords and rotate any associated secrets or keys, like API keys or SSH keys, for all known or suspected affected accounts immediately. In many cases, disabling the compromised accounts entirely might be necessary until they can be fully remediated.
Any more advanced techniques?
If you have the capability and it makes strategic sense in the specific scenario, maybe to buy time for analysis or gather more intelligence on their tools, you might attempt to direct the adversary to a sandbox or a dedicated honeynet environment where you can observe them safely. And throughout containment, you absolutely need to monitor closely for adversary response to your actions. Are they trying alternative access methods? Are they activating backup C2 channels? Are they trying to escalate privileges elsewhere?
And you mentioned this can loop back if you find more problems during containment.
Yes, that iterative nature is key here. If you find new signs of compromise or new adversary activity during the containment phase, maybe they suddenly appear active on a system you thought was clean, or they successfully use a different lateral movement technique you hadn't blocked yet. You have to pause your containment efforts, loop back to technical analysis to understand this new development, and update your understanding of the incident's scope and the adversary's current capabilities before you can confidently resume effective containment actions.
When do you know containment is done?
The terminating condition for the containment phase is typically when you are reasonably confident, based on continuous monitoring, that you have found no new signs of compromise within the contained areas for a defined period, the soak time. You also need to be sure you have preserved all necessary evidence, you've adjusted your detection tools based on what you've learned so far, and you are now ready to move on to the next phase, getting the attacker out for good and fixing what was broken.
Which brings us to phase 4, eradication and recovery. This sounds like the cleanup crew coming in after the fire is contained, getting rid of all traces of the attacker and getting systems back to a secure operational state.
That's a good way to put it. The objective here is really twofold. First, eradication, which is about eliminating all artifacts of the incident, the malware, the tools, the persistence mechanisms, and mitigating the exploited vulnerabilities or underlying conditions that allowed the incident to happen in the first place. Second, recovery, which is focused on restoring systems and services back to normal, secure operations for the business or mission. And like the previous phases, this phase, particularly eradication, is often iterative. You might think you got everything, but find you missed something.
What absolutely has to be in place before you start trying to eradicate the threat? You wouldn't want to start cleaning while the attacker is still actively fighting back, right?
Exactly. There are crucial prerequisites. First, you need to be reasonably confident that you have identified and accounted for all known means of persistent access the attacker might have established. You don't want to clean the front door if they still have a key to the back window.
Makes sense.
Second, you need to be sure that the malicious activity is sufficiently contained. You don't want to be cleaning one system while the attacker is actively compromising another one next to it. Third, and this is critical for forensics and potential legal action, you must ensure that all critical evidence has been collected and preserved before you start making changes that might overwrite or destroy it during the eradication process.
What about coordinating with others?
Yes, very important. It's vital to coordinate your eradication plan with relevant service providers, like your cloud provider or ISP, software vendors, if their product was involved and they have specific guidance, and potentially law enforcement before you begin eradication actions. This ensures everyone is aligned, you follow any vendor best practices for cleanup, and necessary steps are taken if legal action or deeper investigation is planned.
Okay, prerequisites met. What does executing the eradication plan involve?
You execute the eradication plan. This isn't just randomly deleting suspicious files. It should be a coordinated, planned set of actions specifically designed to eliminate all evidence of the compromise and, most importantly, prevent the attacker from maintaining or reestablishing a presence on your network. You need a well-formulated plan because sophisticated attackers often set up multiple ways to get back in numerous backdoors, hidden persistence mechanisms, compromised credentials stored elsewhere.
So it's not just about finding and deleting the malware you initially detected during analysis. It's about actively hunting for and removing every single potential way the attacker could regain access. Like a deep clean.
Precisely. It's a deep clean. Eradication activities involve remediating the affected environments comprehensively. Often, the safest and most effective way is to re-image compromised systems entirely from trusted, gold source clean backups or templates. This ensures no malicious code, configuration changes, or hidden rootkits remain.
Wiping and starting fresh.
For critical systems, yes, that's often the recommendation, especially if root-level compromise is suspected. For less severe compromises, you might replace specific compromised files with known good versions. An absolutely critical step is to install missing patches, especially for the vulnerability that was exploited in the first place. This is a key intersection with the vulnerability response playbook we'll discuss. And crucially, you must reset passwords and rotate secrets for all potentially compromised accounts, user accounts, service accounts, administrator accounts, not just the ones you saw the attacker use directly. Assume wider compromise of credentials.
You have to assume they got more than you saw.
It's the safer assumption. During eradication, you continue to monitor for adversary response. Are they trying to use a persistence mechanism you missed? Did disabling one account cause them to try another? You should have developed response scenarios during analysis for if they try alternative attack vectors you anticipated. And importantly, you must allocate adequate time for eradication. Don't rush it. Be methodical and be sure you have found and eliminated all persistence mechanisms before declaring victory.
And if the incident started by exploiting a vulnerability,
then applying the necessary patch or configuration fix identified through your vulnerability response process is a core mandatory eradication step. You have to close the door they came in through.
And again, this can loop if you find more activity after eradication.
Yes, the loop holds true here as well. If you find new confirmed adversary activity after you thought you had completed eradication, it's a painful sign that they had a persistence mechanism you missed. You have to stop, go back to containment and analysis to understand how they're still getting in, and then reattempt eradication more thoroughly. If eradication is ultimately successful, then you can finally move on to recovery.
Getting the lights fully back on, bringing systems back online, making sure everything is functional and secure.
Yes. Recovery actions are focused on restoring systems and services to normal, secure operations and thoroughly confirming their functionality and security posture before handing them back to business users. This phase can present its own set of challenges.
Like what?
Like, how do you really confirm that your remediation efforts were truly successful and no subtle trace of the attacker remains? The logistics of rebuilding and reconnecting potentially many systems across the enterprise can be complex, and ensuring any data that needs to be restored from backups is accurate, complete, and hasn't been tampered with by the attacker before the backup was taken.
So what actions do you take during recovery?
Actions include carefully reconnecting systems to the network, possibly initially with tightened perimeter security rules, or more stringent zero-trust access controls in place as an extra precaution. You thoroughly test systems, including all their security controls, like EDR agents logging configurations, to ensure they are functioning correctly and securely according to baseline configurations. And critically, you implement and maintain a period of enhanced vigilance, actively monitoring the recovered systems and the surrounding network for any abnormal behaviors that might indicate a hidden persistence mechanism was missed, or the attacker is attempting to regain access using different means.
Staying extra alert for a while?
Definitely. You might also review updated threat intelligence related to the specific attacker or TTPs involved. For major incidents, organizations might consider bringing in independent third-party penetration testers or security auditors to review the recovered environment and validate that recovery is truly complete and the environment is secure before fully returning to normal operations. It's all about being confident that you're genuinely clean and resilient moving forward.
Okay, so the fire is out. The damage is repaired as best as possible. Systems are back online and hopefully secure. But it's still not quite finished, is it? There's phase 5, post-incident activities. This is about learning from what happened and hardening your defenses for the next time.
This phase is absolutely vital for continuous improvement in cybersecurity. An incident, while painful and costly, is also an invaluable learning experience. The goal here is to document everything accurately for the record, inform leadership and relevant stakeholders about the final outcome, harden your environment based specifically on the lessons learned from this incident, and refine your overall security posture and response capabilities so you are demonstrably better prepared for the next inevitable event.
How do you take those hard-won, often painful lessons and translate them into concrete, tangible improvements? What are the key activities?
A key technical step is to adjust sensors, alerts, and log collection based directly on the incident findings. You add new, enterprise-wide detections specifically designed to catch the particular TTPs the adversary used during this incident. If you found they used PowerShell remoting for lateral movement, you make sure you have robust detection rules for that specific technique.
Closing the gaps they exploited.
Exactly. You analyze where your monitoring or logging had blind spots that the attacker leveraged. Maybe you weren't collecting the right event logs or not forwarding them to the SIEM, and you fix those gaps. You might maintain continuous monitoring, specifically looking for signs of the exact persistence mechanisms the attacker favored in this incident. More advanced teams might even try to emulate the observed adversary TTPs in their own test environments to actively validate that their new countermeasures and detection rules are actually effective.
Making sure the fix actually works.
Right. This is all about making sure that if this type of attack, or maybe even this specific attacker group, comes back using similar methods, you're much more likely to detect them much earlier next time, ideally before significant damage occurs.
What about reporting and documentation?
You also need to finalize reports. This includes providing any required formal post-incident updates to CISA, typically within 7 calendar days of incident resolution for federal agencies, and creating detailed reports for your own agency leadership, legal counsel, and any affected external parties, like customers, if their data was breached. You need to create a full, comprehensive post-incident report.
What goes into that big report?
It should document the entire story. The who, what, where, when, why, and how of the incident. It details the confirmed attack timeline, the assessed impact, operational, informational, financial, reputational, the response actions taken in each phase, the determined root cause, the effectiveness of the response, challenges encountered, and critically, the specific lessons learned and recommendations for improvement. You work with CISA to provide any required artifacts or evidence and formally close out the incident ticket in their tracking system.
And the most important part for learning seems to be that lessons learned meeting.
Absolutely. Critically, you must perform a hot wash or a post-mortem analysis. This should be a dedicated lessons learned analysis meeting, or perhaps a series of meetings involving everyone who is significantly involved in the response, from the frontline analysts who detected it, to the system administrators who recovered systems, to IT leadership, legal, communications, and potentially even key external partners like CISA or your IR firm. It needs to be a blame-free environment focused on improvement.
What kind of questions do you ask in the hot wash?
You rigorously review the entire incident response process itself. How effective was our documented plan? Did people follow it? Where did it break down? Was the identified root cause truly the actual root cause, and are we sure it was fully eliminated? What specific problems did we encounter executing our containment or eradication actions? Were there any missing policies or procedures that hampered the response? How could information sharing both internally between teams and externally with partners have been better or faster? Were there training gaps exposed? Were roles and responsibilities unclear at any point? Were there precursors or early warning signs that we missed or didn't investigate thoroughly enough? Were there infrastructure limitations or tooling gaps that slowed us down? For example, not enough log storage, slow forensic tools. What deficiencies in our overall preparation and planning were exposed by this incident?
This sounds like arguably the most important step to ensure you don't just recover from this specific incident, but you actively improve to prevent or mitigate future ones, turning pain into progress.
It absolutely is. Security is fundamentally not a static state you achieve and then maintain. It's a continuous dynamic cycle of preparation, detection, response, recovery, and crucially, learning and improvement. The hot wash provides the essential, structured feedback mechanism to drive that necessary improvement cycle, ensuring that the pain and cost of the incident translate directly into tangible resilience gains for the organization.
Okay, so that gives us a really deep understanding of the life cycle of responding to an active incident. But as you've mentioned several times throughout, none of this happens effectively in a vacuum. Coordination seems absolutely vital.
Absolutely. Coordination isn't really a separate phase you do at the end. It's a continuous activity that needs to be woven throughout the entire response process, from the moment of detection right through to post-incident analysis. It's particularly critical for federal agencies who operate within a broader government ecosystem and have specific requirements to coordinate with partners like CISA.
What does that continuous coordination look like in practice, especially between a federal agency and CISA during an incident?
It starts right at the beginning, with that initial notification to CISA within that strict 1-hour time frame after the agency determines they have a confirmed incident. That gets the ball rolling.
What happens after notification?
CISA acknowledges the report, provides a tracking number, and assigns that NCISS severity rating we discussed. Then, the agency needs to provide regular updates to CISA throughout the response process.
What kind of updates?
Detailing the evolving understanding of the scope of the incident, what systems, accounts, data are affected, the current timeline estimates for containment and recovery, any specific indicators, IOCs or TTPs, the agency has identified the adversary using, the ongoing assessment of the incident's impact, the current status of the response, e.g. actively analyzing, in containment, beginning eradication, and estimated time to completion for key upcoming phases. It's about maintaining shared situational awareness.
And sharing the technical details as you find them.
Critically important. The agency must share IOCs, PTPs, and relevant technical data, like malware samples, if handled safely, with CISA throughout the analysis and containment phases as they are discovered. This sharing is absolutely vital.
Why is that sharing so critical in real time?
Because what the agency is seeing might be part of a much larger campaign affecting other agencies or private sector organizations. Sharing those indicators and TTPs quickly allows CISA to correlate information across multiple victims, identify broader trends, develop effective countermeasures, and proactively warn other potential targets much faster than if everyone kept their findings to themselves. It fuels the collective defense.
And CISA shares back too.
Yes, absolutely. CISA, in turn, shares coordinated cyber intelligence back to the affected agency and potentially to other relevant organizations. CISA acts as a central hub, often integrating intelligence gathered from the broader U.S. intelligence community, law enforcement partners, and international allies. They can provide context, attribution information if known, and guidance based on what they're seeing globally related to that threat actor or campaign.
What about involving law enforcement?
Agencies also need to report to federal law enforcement, typically the FBI for cyber incidents. If the incident appears to have a criminal nexus, like ransomware demands, theft of PII for fraud, or involves nation-state activity, CSIN can help facilitate this engagement and ensure coordination between the asset response, CISA's focus, and the threat response, FBI's focus.
And sometimes incidents get really big, right? What happens then?
Yes. CISA also plays a key role in determining escalation. If an incident is particularly severe, widespread, or impacts critical infrastructure or national security interests, CISA, in coordination with OMB and the National Security Council, NSC, might recommend activating a higher level of whole-of-government coordination. This could involve establishing a formal Cyber Unified Coordination Group, CUCG.
CUCG. Sounds serious.
It is. A CUCG brings together senior representatives from multiple relevant federal agencies, like DHSCI, FBI, ODNI, DAD Cyber Command, sector-specific agencies, and potentially key private sector partners under a unified command structure. It's designed to manage the response to truly significant cyber events that impact U.S. national interest, ensuring a synchronized, whole-of-government effort. Think of it as bringing in the highest level of federal coordination and resource allocation available for a major cyber crisis.
So CICA acts as the main coordinator unless it escalates even higher.
For FCEB agencies, CISA generally acts as the primary federal front door for coordinating the asset response, helping the victim agency protect their networks, mitigate the impact, and recover. But they work closely with other agencies leading different aspects.
Can you explain those different aspects or lines of effort?
Sure. The government often organizes its response to major incidents along different lines of effort, LOEs, with specific lead agencies for each. For example, the threat response LOE is typically led by the FBI. Their focus is on the law enforcement investigation identifying the criminal or nation-state actors responsible, disrupting their ongoing malicious activity, collecting evidence for prosecution, and mitigating the immediate threat they pose. The asset response LOE is led by DHS, primarily through CISA for FCED agencies and critical infrastructure. Their focus is on helping the victim organizations providing technical assistance, helping them protect their networks, mitigate vulnerabilities, reduce the impact on their systems and data, and sharing information to help other potential victims defend themselves. The Intelligence Support LOE is led by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, ODNI, often through components like the Cyber Threat Intelligence Integration Center, CTIX. Their focus is on providing integrated situational awareness based on all source intelligence, conducting deeper intelligence analysis on the threat actors and their motives, supporting attribution efforts, and providing intelligence context to the other response efforts.
So different agencies bring different expertise and legal authorities to the table: investigation, technical assistance, intelligence gathering.
Exactly. This multi-agency LOE approach ensures that all necessary expertise and authorities are brought to bear in a coordinated way during a significant cyber event. While the specific acronyms are federal, the underlying principle is universal for any large-scale response. Bring all relevant capabilities and authorities together, define clear roles, and coordinate effectively.
Okay, that provides a really thorough picture of the incident response playbook and the critical coordination involved, especially in the federal space. Now let's pivot and look at the other side of the coin you mentioned, the vulnerability response playbook. This one seems focused more on prevention, right? Addressing known weaknesses before they lead to incidents.
Correct. Or maybe more accurately, focused on addressing those specific vulnerabilities that are identified as being actively exploited in the wild by attackers. This playbook isn't meant to be a replacement for an organization's standard, routine vulnerability management program.
The day-to-day scanning and patching.
Exactly. The regular scanning, prioritizing vulnerabilities based on severity, like CVSS score, testing patches, deploying them within standard timelines that should always be happening as part of good cyber hygiene. Instead, this vulnerability response VR playbook builds on top of that foundation. It provides accelerated procedures specifically designed for those high-priority, high-urgency vulnerabilities where attackers have already demonstrated the ability and intent to exploit them in real-world attacks.
So this playbook kicks in for vulnerabilities that have jumped the queue, basically, moved from being a theoretical risk on paper to a proven immediate danger because attackers are already using them successfully somewhere.
That's a perfect way to put it. It applies to vulnerabilities that are being actively leveraged by attackers right now. Often these will have a published CVE identifier, but the process could also apply to significant 0 days, vulnerabilities exploited before they were publicly known, or even critical misconfigurations if they are found to be actively exploited at scale.
And it has its own phases.
Yes, it follows a sequence of phases, which somewhat overlap with standard vulnerability management, but operate on a much more compressed timeline due to the urgency. The phases are typically preparation, identification, evaluation, remediation, and reporting and notification.
Okay, let's walk through those. What does preparation look like for vulnerability response?
Preparation for VR relies heavily on having a strong, mature, standard vulnerability management program already in place. A critical, non-negotiable requirement here is robust asset management.
Knowing what you have.
Precisely. You need an accurate, comprehensive, and ideally continuously updated inventory of all your digital asset servers, physical and virtual, workstations, laptops, network devices, routers, switches, firewalls, cloud instances, PaaS, software applications running on all those assets, even potentially systems hosted by contractors or service providers that fall under your security responsibility. You need to know what operating systems and specific software versions are running on those assets. And you need some understanding of the potential relevance or criticality of different types of vulnerabilities to specific asset categories. Again, a web server vulnerability is higher risk on an internet-facing server than an internal one.
It sounds simple, but in large organizations, just knowing everything you have can be a huge challenge. But you can't fix a vulnerability if you don't even know you have the vulnerable software running somewhere or you don't know which specific machine it's on.
Exactly. That accurate, detailed asset inventory is the absolute bedrock for effective vulnerability response. Without it, you're flying blind when a critical alert comes out.
Okay, assuming you have decent asset management, what's the next phase? Identification.
Identification in the VR context means proactively and rapidly finding out about new reports of vulnerabilities that are being actively exploited. This requires actively monitoring key sources.
Like where?
Like CISA products and alerts, they issue weekly vulnerability bulletins, but more importantly for this context, they maintain the known exploited vulnerabilities, KEV catalog, under Binding Operational Directive, BOD 2201.
The KV catalog? What's that?
The KEV catalog is a list curated by CISA of specific vulnerabilities that they have evidence are being actively exploited in the wild. BOD 2201 mandates that federal agencies must remediate, usually patch, vulnerabilities listed in the KEV catalog by specific, often aggressive deadlines, for example, within 2 weeks. This KEV catalog is probably the single most critical source for identifying the vulnerabilities that require this urgent VR process.
So checking the KV list regularly is job number one.
For federal agencies, absolutely. But even for private sector orgs, it's a highly valuable resource because it cuts through the noise of thousands of disclosed vulnerabilities and points to the ones proven to be dangerous right now. You also monitor other external threat feeds. NIST's National Vulnerability Database, NVD, is the canonical source for CVEs. But you also watch trusted security research blogs, cybersecurity news sites like Bleeping Computer, the Hacker News, vendor security advisories, and feeds from commercial vulnerability intelligence services.
Could you find these internally too?
Yes. Crucially, you might even identify an actively exploited vulnerability through your own internal security operations center, SOC, monitoring the MIRDA. Maybe your EDR detects exploit activity, or even during an ongoing incident response investigation, where you discover the attacker got in by exploiting a previously unknown or unpatched flaw. Once identified, you capture key details about the vulnerability, its CVE number, severity rating, CVSS, the specific software versions affected, and critically, any known indicators of compromise, IOCs, or specific detection steps provided by vendors or security researchers that can help you check if you've been hit.
Okay, so you've identified a vulnerability that's on the KEV list or otherwise known to be actively exploited. What's next?
Yeah.
Evaluation.
Right. Once a potential actively exploited vulnerability is identified, you move urgently into the evaluation phase. The very first step here is to determine definitively if this specific vulnerability exists anywhere in your environment.
Back to that asset inventory.
Exactly. You leverage your asset management data combined with your vulnerability scanning tools like Nessus, Qualys, Nexpose, or maybe specialized configuration management databases. For these urgent KE vulnerabilities, you might need to use rapid response scanning profiles or workflows within your tools, or sometimes follow specific, potentially manual technical steps provided in CISA directives or vendor advisories to confirm the presence of the vulnerable software version or configuration. Speed is key here.
And if you find out you are running the vulnerable software somewhere, what's the next crucial question?
The next absolutely critical question is, has this vulnerability already been exploited in our environment? Just because you have the vulnerability doesn't automatically mean you've been compromised yet. but you have to check immediately.
How do you check for exploitation?
This involves conducting rapid sweeps across your network, and specifically on the relevant vulnerable systems, looking for any known IOCs associated with the exploitation of that specific vulnerability. For example, specific file hashes, registry keys, network connections seen in public reports. You actively investigate any abnormal activity observed on those vulnerable systems that might indicate exploitation, like unexpected processes running, strange outbound connections, new user accounts. You meticulously complete any specific detection steps outlined in CISA directives or vendor advisories that are designed to check for signs of successful compromise related to this vulnerability. You might even need to collaborate with third-party forensic experts if the check requires deep technical analysis you can't do quickly in-house.
And what happens if those checks come back positive? If you do find signs that the vulnerability has been exploited on one or more systems?
This is the crucial pivot point. If exploitation is found, meaning the system is not just vulnerable, but also shows clear signs of being compromised as a result, you immediately stop treating it only as a vulnerability, and you initiate the full incident response process using the IR playbook we just spent so much time discussing. That system is now considered a confirmed incident scene.
So VR, VIR.
Exactly. The VR process continues for remediation, but the IR process takes precedence for investigation and containment on that compromised system. At the end of the evaluation phase for each potentially affected system, you should be able to categorize it based on its status. Not affected, it doesn't run the vulnerable software config. Susceptible, it is vulnerable, but detailed checks found no signs of exploitation yet, and remediation actions are starting now. Or compromised, it is vulnerable, and signs of exploitation were found, but the full IR process and VR remediation actions have begun.
Okay, that categorization is key. What happens next for the systems that are susceptible or compromised? That leads to remediation, right?
Well, yes. If the system is categorized as either susceptible or compromised, you move urgently to the remediation phase of the VR playbook. This is about addressing the actively exploited vulnerability itself to eliminate the risk it poses. The primary, and almost always the preferred method for remediation, is patching.
Applying the security update from the vendor?
Correct. You use your standard patch management tools and processes, but often accelerate them using rapid response capabilities or emergency change control procedures, specifically for these urgent KEV issues, to apply the vendor-provided security patch as quickly as possible, meeting those CISA deadlines if applicable.
But what if a patch isn't available immediately? Maybe it's a 0-day, or the vendor is slow, or you can't apply the patch right away due to critical system constraints or testing requirements.
That's a common scenario, unfortunately. If patching isn't immediately possible, the VR playbook emphasizes that you must take other mitigation steps as temporary compensating controls to prevent the vulnerability from being successfully exploited while you wait for a patch or complete testing.
What kind of mitigation?
These are temporary fixes aimed at breaking the likely attack chain. Examples could include limiting network access to the vulnerable system, for example, using firewall rules to only allow connections from specific trusted administrative IPs, blocking external access entirely if possible, isolating the vulnerable system from the broader network onto a restricted segment, implementing permanent configuration changes to the software or the underlying operating system to disable the specific vulnerable feature or component, if possible, without breaking essential functionality, disabling the vulnerable service entirely if it's not absolutely mission-critical, reconfiguring security devices like firewalls or web application firewalls, WAFs, to block access to the specific affected ports, or, if possible, to filter for the known exploit patterns targeting the vulnerable endpoint, or, at a minimum, significantly increasing monitoring and logging on that specific system to rapidly detect any attempt to exploit the vulnerability.
So, temporary shields until the real fix is ready.
Exactly. These mitigations reduce the immediate risk. Once a patch is available and tested, you should apply it as soon as possible, and then you can potentially remove the temporary mitigations if they're no longer needed. Throughout this, you continuously track the status of vulnerable systems, categorizing them as remediated, official patch applied, mitigated, temporary fix applied, patch pending, or still susceptible compromised, awaiting action.
Okay, makes sense. What's the final phase? Reporting and notification.
Yes, the final phase for VR is reporting and notification. This involves two aspects. First, share useful information about these actively exploited vulnerabilities, maybe details about how they are being exploited that you observed, or the effectiveness of specific mitigations you implemented with the broader defense community, including CISA and relevant partners like your ISAC. This helps others prioritize their own vulnerability management efforts and learn from your experience. Second, it involves reporting the status of your remediation and mitigation efforts internally to your leadership and externally to CISA, according to specific guidelines. This might fall under the federal incident notification requirements if systems were confirmed compromised, or reporting compliance against specific deadlines set by CISA boards or emergency directives for susceptible but not yet exploited systems.
So contributing back to the collective defense picture.
Exactly. It closes the loop and helps improve the overall security posture across the community.
Okay, that clarifies the two playbooks really well. Incident response for active attacks already underway, and vulnerability response for urgently addressing those actively exploited weaknesses that could lead to attacks, sometimes finding they already have. Now, let's try to bring it all together. You mentioned a real-world example to see how these concepts play out in practice.
Yes, let's look at a recent concrete case that got a lot of attention. The discovery and exploitation of critical vulnerabilities in the vBulletin's software. This involved two specific CVEs. CVE-2025-48827 and CVE-2025-48828.
vBulletin, yeah, I know that. It's really widely used software for running online discussion forums and communities, isn't it? Lots of websites use it.
Yes, exactly. Very popular, powering countless online communities, which meant these vulnerabilities potentially affected millions of users globally, making them very high impact. They were rated as critical, with CVSS scores right at the top end of the scale at perfect 10-point wear for one and 9.0 for the other.
Wow, 10.0 is as bad as it gets. Which versions were affected?
They affected a range of versions, specifically vBulletin versions 5.0.0 through 5.7.5, and also the newer 6.0 through 6.03 releases, particularly when those versions were running on a server using PHP version 8.1 or later.
And the key point was active exploitation.
Yes, critically, active exploitation was confirmed very quickly after the vulnerability details became public. Attackers were already scanning the internet for vulnerable servers and attempting to use these flaws in the wild almost immediately. That screams urgency.
So, an immediate high-stakes situation for anyone running those versions. What was the actual nature of the vulnerabilities? What did they allow attackers to do?
Well, one was described more generally as an API method invocation flaw related to how the software processed certain external requests. But the other one, and the one that enabled the most severe outcome, was a remote code execution, or RCE, vulnerability.
RCE, that's the scary one.
It really is. This specific vulnerability allowed an unauthenticated attacker, meaning someone without needing to log in or have any prior access, to run malicious code directly on the server hosting the vBulletin software, essentially by abusing the software's template engine.
Unauthenticated remote code execution. That sounds like the absolute worst-case scenario for a web application vulnerability. Game over for that server.
Pretty much, yes. Unauthenticated RCE generally means an attacker could potentially gain complete control over the server running the software, installing backdoors, stealing data, using it to attack other systems, whatever they want, usually running as the web server user initially.
How did it work technically? You mentioned the template engine.
Based on the technical analysis published by security researchers who found it, the core of the problem was quite intricate. It came down to a specific misuse of a powerful feature in the PHP programming language called the reflection API, combined with how vBulletin's own API routing mechanism was designed.
Reflection API in PHP, what's that?
Reflection allows code to examine or introspect other code at runtime, like finding out what methods an object has, or calling methods dynamically by their name. The issue here involved how vBulletin processed certain external API calls, particularly those made via AJAX requests from the browser. It used a mechanism that, due to a subtle interaction with how PHP's reflection API behaved differently in newer versions, specifically PHP 8.1 and later, could be tricked.
Tricked how?
Tricked into allowing an attacker to call internal methods within the vBulletin software code-based methods that were never intended to be exposed to external requests, maybe marked as protected or private in the code. These internal methods often have higher privileges or perform sensitive actions, assuming they can only be called by trusted internal code.
So the attacker found a way to reach behind the scenes, bypass the intended API surface, and directly call functions that should have been off-limits from the outside.
Precisely. And the specific internal method they found they can trigger this way was one related to handling advertisement templates within vBulletin. Why this method? Because it took input from the request and saved it as text that would later be processed by vBulletin's own template engine.
Ah, and template engines can sometimes be dangerous if they process untrusted input?
Exactly. The ultimate vulnerability was that vBulletin's template engine was configured in such a way that when it processed this attacker-controlled template text saved via the vulnerable API method, it would evaluate certain types of template tags that could contain executable PHP code.
And if you can inject arbitrary code into something that gets evaluated by the server, game over again.
That's your direct path to remote co-execution. By crafting specific input containing malicious template tags when calling that internal ad-related API method, an attacker could bypass vBulletin's usual input validation checks. When the software later processed this saved template text containing the malicious tags, that injected PHP code would be executed directly on the server. Researchers demonstrated this could be done using template tags designed to execute PHP functions dynamically. The analysis even highlighted that calling PHP functions using their name as a string, like passing system and then the command wumi, could be executed via the evil function that the template engine was ultimately using under the hood in PHP.
Wow. So a subtle change in how PHP 8.1 handled reflection, combined with a design flaw in vBulletin's internal API routing that unexpectedly exposed a sensitive method, combined with a vulnerability in how the template engine processed user-supplied data within an advertisement feature, all chained together resulted in a critical, unauthenticated RCE vulnerability rated 10.0. A seemingly small technical detail in the language interacting with application design created a massive security hole.
It's exactly right. It's a perfect storm scenario, technically speaking. And it really underscores how complex software interactions and the nuances of language features, if not handled with extreme care and robust security checks at every layer, can create these severe, unexpected weaknesses.
And you said exploitation was seen almost immediately.
Yes, indeed. Security researchers and organizations running honeypots, servers designed to attract attacks, reported seeing exploitation attempts very quickly, specifically targeting the vulnerable Ajax-Piedraplace add template endpoint, which was the entry point identified to trigger this RCE chain. Attackers were observed attempting to use the RCE to deploy PHP backdoors, web shells, onto vulnerable servers and execute system commands to gain control. While initial reports sometimes focused just on the API method invocation part, the full RCE chain was quickly understood by attackers and was the basis for the urgent need for remediation.
Okay, let's explicitly connect this back to the playbooks we discussed. Imagine an organization running a vBulletin forum gets wind of this critical vulnerability announcement. How would the vulnerability response playbook guide their immediate actions?
Okay, first, under the identification phase of VR, they would hopefully learn about this critical issue very quickly. How? They should be monitoring CISA alerts and bulletins if CISA added this CVE to the KV catalog, which it likely would, given the RCE and active exploitation. That would trigger an urgent requirement for federal agencies. They should also be checking external threat feeds they subscribe to, major security news sites like Bleeping Computer or ZDNet, which reported on it extensively, and vulnerability databases like NVD or commercial feeds like Qualys Threat Protect or Tenable. They would see the critical CVSS scores, 10.0, the specific affected vBulletin versions, and the PHP 8.1 plus dependency, and crucially, the widespread reports of active exploitation in the wild. This immediately flags it as a top priority issue requiring the accelerated VR process, going far beyond standard patching cycles.
So, alarm bells ringing. What happens in the evaluation phase for this vBulletin scenario?
In evaluation, their first step is internal. Determine if they actually use vBulletin anywhere in their organization, and if so, are they running one of the affected versions, 5.x or 6.x? And is it on a server using PHP 8.1 or higher? This requires querying their asset management database and potentially running targeted vulnerability scans configured to check for these specific conditions.
Assuming they find they are running a vulnerable version.
Then the critical next step in evaluation is to determine if that vulnerable instance has already been exploited. They can't just assume it hasn't. This means immediately conducting rapid sweeps, specifically looking for known IOCs associated with this vBulletin exploit. Maybe specific file hashes of web shells attackers were known to be dropping, looking for suspicious process execution on the vBulletin web server, like yesh or bash running under the web server user, checking web server logs for requests targeting that specific vulnerable Ajax-Piedraplace add template endpoint, analyzing network logs for strange outbound connections from the vBulletin server. They would need to meticulously follow any specific detection steps provided in the vendor advisory or CISA alerts designed to check for signs of successful compromise from this particular exploit chain.
And if those checks do find evidence of exploitation, suspicious files, weird processes, logs showing the exploit attack succeeded categorizing that system as compromised?
Then, as we discussed, the incident response playbook is triggered immediately for that compromised server, running in parallel with the ongoing VR remediation efforts. The server is no longer just a vulnerable asset, it's a confirmed security incident requiring full investigation and response.
But what if the checks come back clean? They find no evidence of exploitation yet. They categorize the system as susceptible. What does the VR playbook dictate then?
Even if no signs of current exploitation are found, and the system is categorized as merely susceptible, meaning vulnerable but not confirmed compromised yet, the VR playbook's remediation phase still mandates urgent action because the threat is active and imminent. For these vBulletin vulnerabilities, the primary method for remediation identified was applying the specific security patches released by the vBulletin vendor. Patched versions like 6.0.3, patch level 1, 6.0.2 PL1, 6.0.1 PL1, and 5.7.5 PL3, or upgrading entirely to the latest safe version like 6.1.1 were the prescribed fixes to close the hole. These patches needed to be applied much faster than routine updates, often within days or weeks, especially if mandated by a CISA directive.
And if patching couldn't happen instantly, say they needed emergency change approval or had complex customizations to test.
Then the VR playbook requires implementing those temporary mitigations we talked about. For this specific vBulletin RCE, potential mitigations might involve completely isolating the vBulletin server from the internet if feasible until patched, using a web application firewall, WAF, if they have one, to try and configure a rule to specifically block incoming requests to the known vulnerable eject SAPI replace at template URL path, or at the very least, significantly increasing monitoring and logging on the vBulletin server and surrounding network to watch like a hawk for any signs of attempted exploitation while the patch deployment was pending. These are temporary measures to reduce risk until the definitive fix, the patch, could be applied.
Okay. And for the systems that were categorized as compromised, where exploitation was detected, the full incident response playbook runs alongside applying the patch. Can you walk through what that IR might look like for a compromised vBulletin server?
Sure, the detection and analysis phase of IR would kick in immediately. This involves deeply scoping the compromise. Was the attacker only on the vBulletin web server, or did they use that initial access to pivot and move laterally to other systems on the network, like database servers, domain controllers? You'd need to collect all relevant logs, web server, accessor logs, PHP logs, system logs, authentication logs, and likely capture full forensic disk and memory images from the compromised server for deep analysis. The analysis would focus on identifying the attacker's TTPs after they gained the initial RCE. What commands did they run? Did they try to establish persistence, example by creating new admin users in vBulletin, dropping web shells and web-accessible directories, setting up cron jobs or scheduled tasks? Did they attempt lateral movement towards other high-value systems? Did they search for or exfiltrate sensitive data, like the vBulletin user database? Then, containment actions for the compromised server would likely involve immediately isolating it from the network to prevent further spread or C2 communication. It would involve changing all administrative passwords associated with vBulletin and the underlying server OS, and carefully identifying and removing any obvious backdoors, like web shells or malicious files the attacker might have placed. Finally, eradication and recovery would be crucial. Given the RCE, the safest approach is often to completely rebuild the vBulletin server from a known good, clean operating system backup or a gold system image. You wouldn't trust the compromised system even after cleaning. You would then install the patched version of vBulletin before bringing it back online. You'd need to restore the legitimate forum data, posts, users, from a clean backup taken before the compromise occurred, if possible. And after bringing the clean patched server back online, you'd implement that period of enhanced monitoring and vigilance to ensure the attacker wasn't able to maintain some hidden persistence or regain access through another means you missed.
Wow. So this vBulletin example perfectly illustrates how a critical vulnerability, especially one being actively exploited, triggers those specific urgent steps under the vulnerability response playbook, rapidly identifying the risks, evaluating your own exposure and whether you're already compromised, and then either urgently remediating, patching, or mitigating if just susceptible, or if confirmed compromised, immediately initiating that full resource-intensive incident response process alongside the remediation.
It's really a textbook case of how the two playbooks intersect and complement each other.
Yeah.
You have to address the specific vulnerability that served as the entry point, the VR part. But if that entry point was successfully used by an attacker, You then have a full-blown security incident on your hands that requires a much broader response, the IR part, to ensure the attacker is fully evicted, their access is cut off, and they don't have alternative ways back in.
And the technical deep dive into the vBulletin flaw itself, that highlights a broader lesson too, doesn't it? About software development and security.
Absolutely. The technical analysis of how that vBulletin RCE worked serves as a powerful reminder for both software developers and security professionals. Relying on implicit behaviors or internal implementation details of programming languages or frameworks, like how PHP's reflection API worked, or assuming method visibility protected private is a security boundary, is incredibly dangerous. Access controls within an application must be explicit, well-designed, rigorously tested, and enforced by the application logic itself, especially when dealing with untrusted external input or dynamic code execution features. You simply cannot assume that internal language mechanisms will provide adequate security separation on their own, especially when those mechanisms might change subtly across language versions.
A seemingly niche technical detail in a programming language's feature, interacting unexpectedly with an application's routing design and its handling of user input in a seemingly innocuous feature, like ads, cascaded to create an unauthenticated RCE in incredibly widely used software. It's a potent reminder of the interconnectedness and complexity of modern software stacks and the need for deep technical awareness at all levels.
It really is. And it shows that having a structured, methodical approach like the one outlined in these playbooks isn't just about following bureaucratic procedures. It provides the essential framework, the necessary steps, and the critical coordination needed to navigate and hopefully survive these kinds of complex, high-impact technical crises when they inevitably strike our digital systems.
Wow. That vBulletin example really does bring all these concepts to life and certainly underscores the high stakes involved in both vulnerability management and incident response today.
It certainly does. These aren't theoretical exercises. They are critical operational capabilities every organization needs.
Okay, let's try to summarize our deep dive today then. The key takeaway seems to be that having structured, well-documented, and regularly practiced playbooks for both responding to active cybersecurity incidents and for addressing those critical, actively exploited vulnerabilities is absolutely essential for any organization operating in today's digital world. It's not optional anymore.
Agreed. And preparation encompassing clear policies, the right visibility tools, well-trained and exercised people, and proactive cyber threat intelligence is truly the foundational layer that enables everything else. Without solid preparation, your response will likely be chaotic and ineffective.
And the response processes themselves involve clear, though often iterative, phases. From rapidly detecting the problem and conducting thorough analysis to understand its full scope and the attacker's methods.
To decisively containing the damage and stopping the bleeding, then meticulously eradicating the threat and all its traces, and finally safely recovering operations back to a secure state. And all of that must be capped off with that vital post-incident analysis and lessons learned process to actually drive improvement and harden defenses.
And woven throughout all of that is effective coordination, internally between teams and externally with partners like CISA or law enforcement. It's the absolute backbone that ensures a cohesive, informed response, leveraging collective strength and expertise rather than everyone working in silos.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And as we saw with the vBulletin example, real-world incidents demonstrate precisely how seemingly obscure technical details can suddenly escalate into critical, widely exploited vulnerabilities. This highlights the urgent need for organizations to have processes for prompt vulnerability identification, careful evaluation to determine if they are compromised, and then timely remediation, patching or mitigating, or, if necessary, triggering that full incident response. It's a constant interplay between finding and fixing weaknesses and the ever-present threat actors seeking to exploit them.
It really reiterates that security isn't a static goal you achieve and then you're done. It's a continuous, dynamic process of preparing, maintaining vigilance, responding effectively when needed, and constantly learning and adapting.
Absolutely. So what does all this really mean for you, our listener? Whether you directly manage IT systems, write software code, lead security teams, or are just someone who uses technology within an organization, understanding this life cycle of cyber threats and defenses and the structured approach needed to counter them effectively helps us all appreciate the constant, often incredibly complex work required behind the scenes just to stay reasonably secure.
It also really highlights how
quickly a seemingly small technical detail like how a specific programming language feature handles internal methods or how an application processes user input in one minor feature can cascade into a major widespread security incident in software we all rely on. It really demonstrates the need for deep technical awareness and vigilance at all levels, from development through operations and response.
It does indeed.
So here's a final thought to consider as we wrap up. In our increasingly complex and interconnected digital world, where software is built in layers upon layers by different teams, and unforeseen interactions between components can always exist, is it truly possible to ever be fully recovered from a sophisticated incident? Meaning, can you ever be 100% certain that a skilled attacker has been completely evicted and left absolutely no hidden backdoors or subtle persistence mechanisms behind?
That's a tough question. Certainty is hard to come by in security.
Or, given that inherent complexity and the potential for attackers to hide, are we perhaps always inherently in a state of enhanced vigilance after a significant incident? Continuously monitoring with heightened awareness, perpetually prepared for the possibility that the attacker might have left something behind, or that the next threat actor will find and exploit a brand new, unforeseen interaction between these complex systems that we haven't even thought of yet. Is fully recovered a myth, and enhanced vigilance the permanent reality post-breach?
That's a very provocative thought to mull over, certainly. The idea of perpetual vigilance.
Something to think about. Now, a crucial part of both recovery from an incident and effective preparation for future threats is having resilient, secure, and readily available data storage and backups. That's where our sponsor, Stonefly, comes in. They are a leader in enterprise storage, backup, and disaster recovery, AI storage, and cloud solutions.
Having those reliable backups is non-negotiable for recovery.
Absolutely. And if you're looking specifically for secure, ransomware-proof storage options, then Stonefly sells air-gapped and immutable storage solutions designed to protect your critical data, even if your primary systems are compromised. You can contact sales@stonefly.com, that's sales@stonefly.com, to schedule a demo and learn more.
Definitely worth checking out in this threat landscape.
That's our deep dive for today. Thanks so much for diving in with us into the world of incident and vulnerability response.
Stay secure out there.